Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mindfulness Monday, August 9th. Well, it seems that I got my month wrong for my last Mindfulness Monday with you and said it was June instead of August. I laughed when it was brought to my attention because time as we've known it prior to the coronavirus pandemic was easier to follow in a linear type of way. But now it's different. Very different. Life actually seems very non-linear, and each day we anticipate and hope that we're going to be heading towards some kind of straightforward movement that makes more sense to us, but that doesn't seem to be the case just yet. We went into lockdown, lowered the COVID curve, businesses opened up, apparently COVID spiked again, and we were told to take a big step back, and many businesses closed again. And many of them will stay closed for good, which is sad, really sad for those small businesses that have worked so hard to keep their businesses open and thriving. Many people describe this time as if they're stuck in some kind of a surreal dream, and for others, they're calling it a nightmare that they can't seem to wake up from. This is an unprecedented time, and as it's being called, and each of us is having our own experience of what's being called the new normal. Whatever that means, the new normal, or as my former guest, Dr. Joseph Luciani called it, the new abnormal. Whatever we want to call it, we know it's been challenging, anxiety provoking, frightening, frustrating, confusing, and even maddening. And for others, they're finding it a time of personal transformation, which I've talked about quite often. But what if we had some type of roadmap to get through it? And it was the yoga of wisdom. When we think of yoga, we see it as a spiritual discipline to master bodily postures, or asanas as they're called. But yoga is much, much more than that. Yoga, or the philosophy of yoga, can teach us the knowledge or wisdom we need for everyday life, especially when it's fraught with difficulty and suffering, which brings me to my special guest today, SEANE CORN. Let me tell you a little bit about her. SEANE CORN is an internationally acclaimed yoga teacher and public speaker known for her social activism, impassioned style of teaching, and raw, honest, and inspired self-expression. Over her 25-year teaching career, SEANE has created many instructional DVDs, including her groundbreaking series, The Yoga of Awakening, with Sounds True. Featured on over 40 magazine covers and countless media outlets, SEANE has chosen to use her platform to bring awareness to global issues including social justice, sex trafficking, HIV/AIDS awareness, generational poverty, and animal rights. In 2005, SEANE was named National Yoga Ambassador for YouthAIDS, and in 2013 received both the Global Green International Environmental Leadership Award and the Humanitarian Award by the Smithsonian Institute. Since 2007, she has been training leaders of activism through her co-founded organization, Off the Mat into the World. SEANE also co-founded the Global Seva Challenge, which has raised over $3.5 million by activating communities of yoga and wellness in fund and awareness raising efforts. Her first book, Revolution of the Soul, was published in fall 2019. Welcome to Mindfulness Monday, SEANE. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hi. Wonderful. Hi, welcome. So excited to have you here.
Thank you so much, Ora. It's a joy to have the opportunity to speak with you.
Yeah, I've been wanting to do this with you for a while, and I'm glad we're having this time today. Great way to start off the week. So, I want to start off by saying that I loved your book, Revolution of the Soul. Beautiful cover, beautiful book. It was quite the journey to be taken on from the beginning to the end. And each time I read something that felt raw and truthful and resonant for me, you continued on and gave us more rawness and more truth. You never let up, which I thought was great, by the way. And it was as if you were saying, I'm going to take you up the entrails of my life journey. And in there, you will find your rawness and truth because each of us has come through the darkness in some way. Was that at all your intention when you wrote the book?
No, no, not at all. I I was really insecure when I first sat down to write the book. I had been told for years that I should write a book, but just because you can get up in front of a room of people and speak extemporaneously and tell a good story doesn't mean you actually have the skill to sit down and organize those stories or to somehow strategize the arrangement where it actually makes sense. And so I resisted for years and years. And finally, right before I turned 50, I'm 53 now, and I think around 48, I knew that it was time, that this was, it just felt like the arc was happening where I was going to have to sit down and do this. And when I first opened up my computer and started writing, the first line that I wrote was, just because I was just kind of figuring out how to go through the process, it was, my name is Cece. And when I wrote that, I gasped because my name is Sean, but my childhood nickname is Cece. And it's a name my family still calls me by, but it's a different identity. And when I wrote that, the first thing, and it didn't make it into the book, but I knew in that moment that the book was about to take me on a journey that I was ill prepared for, because I wasn't meant to write the book as Sean. I needed to write it as Cece. Now, I'm going to talk about myself in third person, but Cece didn't have mentorship. She didn't have experience. She had issues with drugs and alcohol. She had obsessive compulsive disorder, childhood sexual abuse. There were a lot of factions in my relationship to Cece that I don't have as an adult now. Because Sean has skill and mentors and teachers and therapists. And so to sit back and recognize that I need to write this book through a lens of not knowing, where I'm actually in the experience, because what happens too often, especially in the spirituality and wellness communities, is an organic bypass, meaning that we have the information. So often we will override our own emotions to what's called over understand, meaning I'll tell you how I feel, but I don't actually feel it. And in a classroom, it's easy to emote an experience, but move on quickly. In a book, it had to be unpacked, and it was vulnerable and raw and honest, transparent, all the things that I invite my students into. For the first time in many years, I was being called up by Spirit saying, you're going to walk your talk, because you're not going to tell them how to heal. You're going to model the messiness, the complexities of it, and how nuanced, and also that it's a never ending process, which is why I formatted it the way I did, to your point, in that even as I grow older in the book and the stories, I begin to mature and my awareness becomes just a little bit more sophisticated, I'm still making, for lack of a better word, mistakes. I'm still going down the rabbit hole of my ignorance. The difference is that because I'm also gaining tools, the rate in which I stay in my stuckness gets shorter and shorter, as it is for all people. And so that was really the journey. It was 3.5 years. It was, I tried to talk myself out of it 100 times. And I came up with a mantra at one point, which was, I had to write everything, but I didn't have to print anything. And it gave me agency over my story. And that was really important. As someone who had survived sexual childhood trauma, the thing that had been taken away from me was agency of my body. So when telling my story, I got to pick and choose how it would get told and in what way. And if I didn't want to share any of it at all, I made that decision at the 11th hour. I could pull it all back.
Mm-hmm.
Because I wrote it and because I processed it along the way, by the time I published the book, there were very few stories that I plucked out. And the only reason I did was because it didn't serve the story, not because I was afraid to share. So it was a very cathartic, very intense journey. I'm glad I did it. But I don't understand people, perhaps like yourself, who could just pick up a pen and just write and just throw it down. I labored over this experience.
Yeah, it's giving birth. It really is. It's a birthing. I wrote Live True right after my sister died, and I don't know, and I was in full on grief, and I don't know how I did it, but I did it. So, there's something that's bigger than maybe we even are conscious of that needs to come through. And it's interesting because you say you wrote it as, well, you sat down, or the first words were Cece, which when you said that, I'm like, I don't remember that. But that I wonder if the younger self that is ready to really expose herself was the one that said, I'm ready. Let's do this. I'm ready to do this. Do you know?
Sure,
All that was there.
And,
Go ahead.
She definitely wanted recognition. She wanted the story to be told in a very specific way, but I didn't anticipate that. And I also wasn't quite sure how to manage it along the way. And that's why I wrote the book. The narratives start when I'm about 18 and end in my late 40s. And but I tell a narrative, and then at the end of each chapter, there's a secondary chapter, which is me at this age.
Yeah, which is great, by the way. I love that. The juxtaposition that you chose to do, I think, is really interesting, because it was a complete journey in a way I don't recall being taken on by an author quite like that.
It gave me a chance to jump into both roles. Because as Sean, like I said, I have a certain amount of experience after all these years. So I can look backwards in time with a lot of compassion and patience and presence, and just the wisdom of life and certain tools and skills that I can then say, here's what was actually going on. Here's what I couldn't have known when I was in the middle of it. Here's how I can now look back and say, this was what was going on. It was this quality of life, experience, philosophy. But as Cece, it had to be in present time with no awareness. I was just stuck in the overwhelm of the moment. And so that way I got to actually live in two different voices and meet a part of myself that, I've been in therapy since I was 18 years old. So it's not like I had suppressed a lot of this information. But when you're a teacher, there's an identity that's very easy to fall into that can be quite addictive, that sets you up to avoid your own vulnerability. And I realized in the writing of this, especially because I'm older, that I had avoided touching base with that more vulnerable part of myself for many, many years. And she had something she wanted to say. And I think also that part of my consciousness was afraid that I would write the book from a place of, I would have distanced myself from my own humanity and written the book from a place of maturity, and would have missed a real opportunity to be in service to people, because a lot of books, that's how books are often written, from the lens of the expert, if you will. Yeah. And I wasn't called to do that. The process is much more humbling and humiliating and human. And I wanted to show people that there's nothing to, it doesn't mean you're any less spiritual. because you're in that very vulnerable process of not knowing. So I had to model it.
Right. I mean, it's not mutually exclusive at all. And what comes to mind to me is, for someone that I've been in Jungian analysis for many, many years, and, we want to become whole. We want to merge the aspects of ourselves that have been wounded or fractured or disassociated or, traumatized. And the way in which you wrote it, I think it was really so beautiful, Sean, because you really honor the voice of the younger self. And then the wise woman is there with her as if she's holding her hand. And I found that to be quite beautiful, really, really beautiful. Your trajectory that led you to become an internationally acclaimed yoga teacher was fascinating. Starting off working as a bartender at an all-male gay sex club called Heaven didn't seem like a place a future yogini would emerge from. I mean, it's what a ride, what a great ride. It was there that you met what seemed to be your first, I guess I think of him as a spiritual teacher. You called him your dear angel, Billy. Tell our listeners a little bit how this place, Heaven, is where you were first told to ignore the story and see the soul, as you write about so beautifully in your book.
Again, as an adult, I can look back and realize that I, as we all are, very well guided, and that the universe will give you teachers, angels, if you will. They'll show up in different ways, in different forms, and it doesn't always look the way that you think it should look. And at that time in my life, I was an atheist. I had moved away from home. I suffered from trauma. I had obsessive compulsive disorder, which I wasn't aware of at that time. I didn't know there was a name to it. So I struggled with anxiety and used drugs and alcohol as a way to anesthetize myself from the big feelings that I had. And I worked at an all-gay sex club in an old church called Limelight in New York City. And in Limelight, there was a private club called Heaven. And that's where I served alcohol. And there was a man who came to the club, Billy, who adored me, African-American man in his late 50s, and had a really rough backstory himself, had been ostracized from his community, from his family, because of the fact that he was gay, moved to New York City to live out that truth. This was in the 80s. And at that time, homosexuality was still, especially for someone in the Midwest, this was not something that was going to be acceptable in certain communities. Billy had issues with my doing drugs, and he was in the program and deep in his recovery at that point, and would, give me a hard time. And, but he loved me. And there was a 3-week period that Billy doesn't show up in the club. But there's no cell phones, so I can't contact him. And one day he shows up, walks through the club. I see him. I lean over the bar to give him a hug. And when I do, before I make physical contact with him, I notice he has these open sores all over his shoulder and his neck and his face. And I withdraw and ask him, like, oh my God, what happened? And he tells me they were symptomatic of his disease, and which of course was HIV/AIDS. But even though I worked in an all-male gay sex club, it was still the 80s. There was a lot of prejudice, a lot of fear around the disease, a lot of ignorance. And so when he said the word AIDS, I recoiled. And I remember him just being so hurt by that. And he asked me if I wanted to understand more about the disease. And I said, of course. And he explained it to me. And I asked him what was going to happen. And he told me that he was dying. And I asked him if he was afraid. And he said he wasn't, because of his faith in God. And when he said faith in God for the second time, I recoiled. And this time he laughed and he asked me if I believed in God. And I told him that I didn't. And I explained why. I told him just about my own upbringing and the ways in which God showed up in my community. Not my parents. I'm half Jewish, half Catholic, and my parents raised us with no religion. But in the periphery, there was a lot of fear around God, a lot of judgment, and I was terrified of this looming figure. So I made the decision that I was an atheist. And Billy laughed and he said, "Sean, do you want to see God right now?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. Show me God." Now remember, I'm in a gay sex club. There's,
Not
So,
not the guy with the long beard and the white robe.
no, he points to Danny the Wonder Pony, who was this white guy who came into the club with naked except for a saddle and a pair of chaps. And for $1, you could ride on his back and you can hit him with a switch. And Billy says, "God's right there." And then he points towards a person at that time that we would have called a cross-dresser. Now, of course, we would refer to this person as being transgender. But Billy points towards this person, about 6'6" in a light blue house dress, gray wig with a hat with a veil and a little pocketbook, and says, "God's right there." And then points to these two men arguing playfully on a bench in a booth over a pitcher of beer, and says, "God's right there." And then Billy takes my hand and he puts it over his chest, and he takes his hand and puts it over mine like this. And he said, "And Sean, God's right here." And he says, "I'm going to tell you something right now, and I hope you remember this the whole of your life. Ignore the story and see the soul, and remember to love. You'll never regret it." And what Billy then proceeded to tell me was that it was all a story. Danny the Wonder Pony, Violet, the transgender woman, the two men, me, Billy, all of it. It's a narrative in our life. They're aspects of our journey, but it's not who we are, and who we are is love. And that all of us are here to learn. And the way in which we learn is different for each person, depending on their own karma, their own journey. And our work was to focus inward on our own experience and not live in judgment for someone else's. So ignore the story and see the soul, and remember to love. You'll never regret it. And in all the years that I've been on this path, which is a long time now, I have never been handed wisdom to that capacity. It let me step back and look at the world and realize that everyone is doing the best they can with what little they know, based on their own trauma and the lack of tools that they had available at that time. And that each person's journey is between them and the God of their own understanding, and that we're all awakening to love. It's just the rate in which that happens is very individual. But if I'm in judgment to someone else's journey, then it means that I've got work to do, and I've got to turn my attention back inward, because odds are I'm experiencing something in them that I've rejected within myself, or that I'm terrified of. So Billy was a significant teacher to me at that time. And of course, Billy died not long after that conversation, but I've never, ever forgotten those words. And it truly has impacted the whole of my path.
Such a powerful initiation, into the understanding, as you say, of compassion and acceptance and love, because, I remember grappling also as a young psyche, younger in my life, about what the benevolent God looked like versus what a wrathful God looks like. Do you know what I mean? Like, well, how could there be all this killing and hatred and darkness, and how can you have genocide, and how can you have Holocaust, and how can you have people hate so much, and how can you have prejudice? Is that God's work? And so the way in which we come to understand what this divine presence means to us and what we assign it to mean, do you know that it can't be, a transgender in a club? It can't look like that. It's got to look like something else, and so we focus on this something else, thinking that there's a separateness from what is divine, and it's not at all. What a powerful initiation. It took me through my Jungian analysis to really get that, to move beyond the understanding that God just has to look, or I have to perceive God as some benevolent presence or entity, when it's everything, including the dark aspects of human existence, so these are, what a powerful initiation that was at such a young age. I could see we're going to fly through this interview. There's so many things I want to talk to you about. I want our listeners, Sean, to get a sense of how yoga off the mat looks like, in that, how can we take the understanding of yoga and apply it to our lives daily? Meaning, for those that maybe don't practice yoga, I'm a mindfulness practitioner, so I talk about mindfulness as being in the present moment in all the moments of our lives, not just on the yoga mat or on the meditation pillow. And obviously you coined that beautiful expression, off the mat and out into the world. But for our listeners out there, help them along in understanding that a little bit more. You write in your book that the themes of interconnectedness, loving kindness, and mindful actions run through many ancient yogic texts and teach the ways in which we can live more consciously and with greater compassion. We have much more time right now during our isolation to actually be more reflective and to go within. So tell our listeners, if you will, how they can use this time, as challenging as it may be, and to go from separation to connection, as you write about.
That is the thing that's popping into my head, because the complexities of your question run so deep, because there's no finality to that answer. Taking yoga off the mat into the world really means the recognition of that our liberation is bound, and that I can't be free, we can't be free unless everyone is free. That's basically like the goal. Like, we look outward and we realize that yoga teaches us everything is in relationship, the shadow and the light. You can't know the light without the shadow. And heaven and earth, matter, consciousness, me and you. There is no separation. What we see in our world today, the way in which our systems operate, they depend on division. They depend on dominance and oppression, power over, power under. It depends on otherizing. Again, the opposite of yoga. And so anyone who wants to see great social change often looks towards our systems and say, you need to change leadership, you need to change policies, without recognizing and identifying that there's actually nothing that's happening out in the world that we ourselves are not participating in the micro. Meaning that within ourselves and our own personal relationships, we are also otherizing and power over, power under, playing with dominance and oppression. Until we orient and take accountability for the ways in which we have internalized belief systems that impact our ability to really connect, then why would we think the systems are going to change? To change the systems, we have to change the people. So I look at that question like, okay, here's the goal. We're going out there, we're going to change this world. But now let's go inward. And going inward, the way in which yoga asana, the physical poses, impact us is that what people embody, hold onto, is trauma. And trauma is anything that overwhelms our capacity to cope and leaves us feeling helpless, hopeless, out of control, or unable to respond. Very often when folks think of trauma, they think shock trauma, those big unimaginable events that are often one-offs. But what we all experience is developmental trauma. These are the traumas from our youth that are, before we have the words to express our big feelings, like bullying, death of a loved one, divorce. When we experience any kind of trauma, the brain, of course, releases chemicals into the body, cortisol, adrenaline. Our body goes into fight, flight, freeze, or collapse as a mechanism of safety and control. So in the moment of overwhelm, the child's experience in order to create control is to contract the body. When the body contracts, whatever that narrative was, the narrative itself is an energy. Everything is energy. That's what bonds all of us. Emotions are energy. Love is an energy, but so is fear and shame and rage and guilt and grief. So a child has this experience, these big feelings come up, they become internalized, the body contracts, the energy is now stored in that cell. If the child has been raised in an environment where they have been taught to scream, rage, express, what happens is they're able to discharge and release the energy out of their body. But we're not taught this. We're often taught to suppress, meaning you're upset about something and your mom says, oh, you're sad, here, have a cookie. Or you're angry, let's go shopping, I'll buy you a little present. So we get taught to self-soothe at a very early age, which later in life then becomes drugs, alcohol, shopping, food, sex, etc. Well, trauma is cumulative. So the next time I experience an event that in my unconscious reminds me of that earlier event, my body contracts. That tension, it keeps building and building and building. Tension, stress, and anxiety are the #1 causes of illness and depression today. What yoga does is it releases the tension. And when the tension releases, the emotions that live in the cells start to come up to the surface. And if you have a good teacher, the teacher invites you to stay with the sensation, to observe the thoughts, to notice the dissociation, the fantasy, all the different ways on the mat or on the cushion when we don't have access to the food or the sex or the drugs or the alcohol.
Right.
We have our mind and our imagination that takes us out of present time. Now, why I'm bringing all of this up, why it's so important in this moment, is that right now in our world, we are dealing with both individual and collective trauma on a huge level. As a result of that, people's response to that, the feeling of unsafety, the feeling that the rug has been pulled out from underneath us, it's all first chakra trauma, which is fear. Money, loss, grief, it's triggering all the loss that came before, all the feelings of unsafety that's come before, but also ancestral. So depending on where your family of origin is from, or what your history is, it's also triggering those feelings of unsafety as well. So when I'm talking with students right now, they're tired, they're overwhelmed, they're scared, they're fatigued, they're acting out, they're deeply anxious, they're afraid that their sobriety is going to be compromised or it has been compromised, and it's because we are in trauma. So what we have to do is breathe, get in our bodies and self-regulate the nervous system,
Right.
ground the body, discharge the energy, feel the feelings, cry, rage, communicate, whatever you can do to express this moment in time so that that tension is not staying in the body. And so that we can respond to the chaos of this time rather than react. Because when we're in our fear, we will react. When we're in trauma, we try to replicate the original trauma, meaning that if I was a child and I've experienced bullying and I have been in a situation where I feel powerless, later on in life, that feeling of powerlessness is going to live in me. So I might react by going powerful, aggressive, assertive, to balance out that feeling of powerlessness. Oppression, dominance. So I'm just playing out the same behavior that I'm suggesting I want changed. So if I can identify it within my own body and practice the tools of self-regulation, then maybe when I go out into the world, before I react to a situation that might trigger me, I remember to ground, to breathe, to self-regulate my nervous system, to identify the uninvestigated information before I open my mouth, because what I might say could create harm if what I'm going to say has been influenced by my unprocessed trauma. Does this make sense, what I just said?
Absolutely. I mean, I brought mindfulness into one of the schools in LA because they were forming clubs, and during the debates, there was a lot of dissent amongst these high school kids in this particular club. And one of this really smart young man who wanted to create a club called Civil Discourse, because he was really upset that he and his friends were starting to dislike each other. They couldn't even converse about their differences, which was a really wonderfully mature desire to have, to understand better how they could speak without being going into reactive mode, and being more in the observation or witness mode, if you will. So it's wonderful to see that going into schools and going into the younger demographic, so that they can understand that what that mindful awareness or self-regulation is about, so that they don't just spew out things from their mouth. Now, it's not just young adults. We as adults are doing it all over the place. I mean, the lack of civil discourse that I see going on right now is really disconcerting, in the way people are talking to each other. That we can't sit down, and yes, we can get heated up, we can feel anger, that's okay. But I think that if we don't have an awareness of what are the thoughts that are creating the emotions, I wrote a book, Says Who, which is a cognitive method for transforming negative and fear-based thoughts, in understanding that many people get taken over by emotion. And I say, behind, somewhere hidden in that emotion is a thought. We need to know what's triggering those emotions. So all of these skill sets that you're talking about that are so important, that we're seeing a manifestation of this being acted out with very high levels of radioactivity, if you will, or reactivity, which comes off sometimes radioactive. If we don't get that, we're not going to really be that change that we keep talking about. How much are we going to keep talking about the change that we want to see happen in the world if we don't do the very things that you're describing, and learning that within? Which takes me to my question. You talk about the importance of svadhyaya, which means self-study, right? I talk a lot about the inner journey and the importance of that, and how we can apply it to our spiritual evolution, whether we practice yoga or not. And during this time in isolation, which I feel is really ripe for getting to know ourselves better, to go within. We don't have as many distractions unless we continue to give ourselves those distractions. We've gone more within the home. We've gone more within the family unit. We've gone more, hopefully, within ourselves, so that we can start to implement these practices that you've written about so beautifully, that I teach with mindfulness, so that we don't see all this stuff keep playing out over and over again in the way in which it is. So speak to us more, Sean, about svadhyaya, if I'm saying that right, the importance of self-study, the importance of going within.
Yeah, you brought up many interesting points. I reflect back to Billy, in that when you're in it, you can't see it. And right now, in this moment of history, we are in something that I don't think we can understand until years and years later, when we look back and we can see the opportunity in this moment. Like I said before, our world is in trauma. The way in which our current administration has chosen to use language has excavated deep trauma within our culture. And sometimes I think it's strategic in so many ways, because that this trauma has always been there. Racial terrorism, unrest, it's been there, but it's been deeply suppressed. And especially if you're white identified like myself, if you're part of the dominant culture, it's very convenient not to actually have to look at what's happening in the world, because it doesn't directly affect me. But folks on the margins, Black and brown people, they're very aware of the injustice and the oppression that has existed. But this current administration has really brought it up to the surface. It's holding a mirror up to all of us to recognize the ways in which those belief systems have been internalized, and the ways in which we have been, some of us have been benefiting from those imbalances of power. So there's a deep trauma that's been excavated. But when trauma gets brought up and there aren't any tools, the natural response is going to be rage. But when rage meets rage, or fear meets fear, nothing can happen.
Right.
We will end up turning on each other and on ourselves. And that's why I say sometimes I think it's strategic, because we're basically doing the work to divide. The government doesn't even have to, because we're doing it to ourselves. But it's because there is a deep level of internalized frustration and rage that hasn't been addressed. The opportunity is that we get to right now look within ourselves and take accountability to the ways in which we benefit from the oppression of others, contribute to the oppression of others, the ways in which we have been a part of these systems that have been designed to divide. Svadhyaya invites you, self-study, asks you not to look out at, for example, the administration and say, you need to change. I have to first take a moment and say, where does this live within me, and what do I need to do in order to change it, and to take accountability, and not get arrogant about my own humanity, but to see the ways in which a lot bias and prejudice and stereotyping have been normalized within my consciousness, right, and the impact that it has on my life. So during this time of isolation and COVID, not everyone, I just want to say, has the luxury of using this time as a reset and as a space for reflection. There obviously are a lot of people right now whose lives are at stake and who are trying to find ways just to survive and feed their families. And so I don't want to be insensitive not to acknowledge that. Folks like myself, and perhaps some of the people who are listening, who have access to resources, who know that although inconvenient, it's not going to change too much in our life going forward, that we actually can reset, which has been my experience. I have used this time to look at my attachment to my identity, to look at my relationships with my family, to look at my relationship to being a mentor as I grow older within my community, at the ways in which I used busyness as a way to avoid the beingness. So everyone in this time is going to have a different experience. My hope, though, is for those who are listening, who can use this time to turn in, this moment in time may never happen again. Absolutely. Where we're being forced to stop, right, and to look at who we are, where we've been, and where we're going. During this time for myself, I took a suture course, an anatomy course. I took another teacher's training, for God's sakes, all online. I figured, why not? Because I didn't want to miss this opportunity to have to look inward at my own experience. And I hope that others can do the same, because as dark as this world can go is as light as it can be. But it requires people who are the light workers, and light workers just rely on tools. There are tools. It's deep work, it's awkward work, but no better time to do it than in isolation, when it's you, your breath, your yoga mat or cushion, and the craziness of your mind, that you get to have to look inward and get still. So that's my suggestion to people, that this is a spiritual time. It's a symbolic time. It's almost if you are a spiritualist and you look at you work to assign meaning even to the incomprehensible, which is what I do. I can't help but look at this moment and feel this odd sense of terror for the unknown and deep gratitude, because it's incredible invitation for us as a society to wake up, to do the inner work necessary, and then get out into the world and be in service to other folks and end this divide by acknowledging our participation in that fracturing.
That's
We
right.
can't change what we won't see. And right now, there is a light shining on these injustices. And therefore, we get to change it because it's all been illuminated.
Right. And even, as you said, those of us that might have the luxury to go within and do the work on ourselves, you know, and I don't want to say that it's just a luxury, but yes, for those people that are in a heightened state of survival mode, they're not spending time maybe trying to find out more about the journey of self-realization. They're trying to figure out how to put food on the table for their 5 kids, you know, so I completely get that. Our job, I think, for those of us that maybe have more of that time to do so, I think it's really, again, going up the entrails of self so that we can become better human beings and therefore help others that need our help the most. Do you know, that's why this time is valuable, not just for getting to know ourselves on our own path of personal transformation, but how can I be a better human being when I'm out in the world, as you said. You know, speaking of this particular topic, which is so timely, you know, you wrote your book last year, but pretty early on in your book, you talk about privilege, and you mention it when you were, you know, you mentioned a couple of times in the book, which jumped out at me, especially juxtaposed to the times that we're in right now. And you talked about it as early as when you worked at Life Cafe in New York, and you were in your 20s, and how your boss told you that you had privilege. And because you do, you have a responsibility to be much more compassionate and understanding to those who may not get the opportunities you'll get in this life. You mentioned it a couple more times throughout the book, and also when you're in India and brought on stage, you felt because you were a white blonde woman. White privilege is a big it's a big topic right now. We just said that, especially after the Black Lives Matter movement recently happened after the brutal murder of George Floyd. How would you apply what you already understood about having white privilege then to what's recently happened with the BLM movement? I mean, you had an awareness, you know, we've known of systemic racism. It's not like it just came up. You know, but our relationship to the understanding and taking a deep dive into it, it's a game changer. The needle has moved as far as I'm concerned. So I'm asking you that because you actually self-admittedly talked about that, about yourself, which I thought was very cool, very honest. And so now, because of it being the very subject that we really need to look at closely, how would you apply that to what you knew then to now?
It doesn't change. It's a constant understanding. Privilege is this constant unfolding. In the book, I still keep unpacking it over the course of 4 or 5 chapters. When I got into service back in the day, I went out there to help, not understanding that my helping was cloaked in hundreds of years of colonization, of missionary work, of all this other stuff that I was clueless about. I was like, I don't understand. I felt so misunderstood. I would get emotional about it because I didn't understand that my behavior was really replicating some of these ways that we continue to stay separate. So
that was very insightful, by the way, very insightful, and was going to be one of my questions to you, because your realization was very astute, and I want to hear more about that.
But it was that's what happens when you start kind of going out into the world, when the natural progression of doing the inner work is looking outside of yourself and saying like, oh my God, like my joy comes from being able to uplift society in whatever way I can. It becomes part of our spiritual practice. But we don't even realize, though, that we're causing harm. And it got drawn to my attention again and again and again that I was causing harm. And so I had to really
talk about that, Sean, though, more, how it was really humbling. And specifically, like when you were in Uganda, you had that experience that was very, again, very insightful.
Yeah. I mean, in Uganda, again, I went out there to help. And I, in that chapter, I really make the connection between permaculture, which in permaculture, everything is in relationship. And if any aspect of that relationship is disordered, that it wasn't sustainable. And in Uganda, what the man there was trying to tell me is that my need to help in the way that I was offering it wasn't permaculture. It wasn't in relationship. It wasn't sustainable. It was masked in supremacy. And it didn't have any, it's like when you see homelessness and you're like, I'm going to give that person a sandwich. That only changes the experience for a moment. It might feed that person, which is important and great. It might make me feel good, but it doesn't address the systems that have caused the homelessness in the first place. So real service addresses the systems. And in Uganda, that was what I was being told, is that I wasn't addressing the systems. I was putting a Band-Aid on the wound. And as a white person, that's often what we get to do. We get to go in as saviors, as heroes, and here we go. I'm gonna throw money at a situation. And in Uganda, they wouldn't take my money. So it set me on this trajectory of having to really understand the difference between charity and social justice. And all of a sudden I realized that racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ageism, ableism, it's all internalized in my body. And I've inherited that information in the same way I inherited my curly hair and my blue eyes, that it didn't just go away. It was in my school, it was in my religion, it was in my community. And so I had to unpack all the ways these belief systems influence the way I experience the world and the way in which the world experiences me. And it is uncomfortable. And it exists today in this moment. So many of us are all of a sudden, we're outraged because there's racial terrorism. First of all, this racial terrorism has existed. It never ended. It's not new. We're just becoming a little bit more alert to it. And our white privilege doesn't really let us look at the ways in which we contribute to that terrorism each and every day, even in the form of microaggressions. I would recommend for anyone right now who want to do some really deep inner work around looking at power and privilege, looking at the ways in which we internalize racism, would be Layla Saad, S-A-A-D. Her book, Me and White Supremacy.
Right.
Will anyone who's listening, this will be a journey that it's confrontational, it's humbling, and it is essential. The same with the book, White Fragility. Those two resources.
I read it, yes.
Many others.
Yeah.
But for people who just want to start unpacking, and I write about it in my book a lot, by taking accountability, because that's the only way we can change it. Meaning that when I hear people say, I don't see color, and I see white people say that, then you don't see the history. You don't see the trauma. You don't see the culture, their arts. You don't see all the different ways that have informed this human being. And I think that that's something that we have to, as white people, we have to look at that the invisibilization, because it makes us uncomfortable.
Right. Yeah.
And that's the deep work, and it's a deep yoga. It's the deepest yoga that most of us will have to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have two sons. One is 20 and one is 27. And we got into this whole conversation the other night, and it was really powerful. And I learned so much from them, because my older son went out and protested, and, he's always had such an international group of friends, and from, all different ethnicities. And both my kids, really, they went to school that was one of the most diverse schools here in Los Angeles. So they shined a lot of light on things for me from a younger person's perception of this, which I thought was very illuminating. And it actually gave me great hope, in that the way in which they're looking at this is quite different than the way I feel I had looked at it as a woman at this point in my life, who also grew up in an environment that was very diverse. I went to, schools that had the first iteration of busing. I lived in a multiracial home environment growing up, but they taught me so much more than I could imagine. And this conversation is got so many layers to it. And I think reading these books that you mentioned, so important. And talk to your kids, because they're going to teach you a thing or two about this that you may have not known. And the way in which they see it, I feel, is really very forward thinking, which again really gives me hope about where we're moving with this conversation. Sean, we're almost out of time, which I cannot believe is happening, because I thought that we would have a little bit more time to cover more of the questions. Let's go through some of these a little bit more quickly, if you will. Tell our listeners what it means to live your Dharma. And I mean Dharma meaning let's all live our Dharma. What does that look like?
I mean, it's going to be different for each person, but to live your truth, to live your purpose, to do the inner work necessary so that we can develop the self-confidence, so that we can trust our intuition. Our intuition is going to guide us into our Dharma so that we can say yes, even in moments where we second guess or we stop trusting. We allow ourselves to be guided from within. Low self-esteem is a pandemic within our culture. And when we look outside of ourselves for identification, meaning my sense of self or even my purpose is dependent upon the amount of money I have or the way I look or the relationship that I'm in, all things that are temporal, that change, that go away, we suffer. When we do the work to develop self-confidence with a capital S, where our self-esteem is in relationship to spirit, to love, to compassion, to truth, no one can take us that away. It's something that's evolutionary and maturing, but it's always there. And our purpose will be defined by that inner knowing. And so doing the inner work, developing self-confidence, listening to our intuition via meditation, prayer, whatever the spiritual practice is, and taking the next right action to be in the teachings and to open yourself to whatever that the teachings reveal as our purpose. And that's what it is to live your Dharma, is just to do the work and let the work evolve. Try not to get so stuck. Like right now, it might be yoga. It might evolve into something else. I don't know. But to let your body continue to learn and grow and grab these tools for self-awareness and actualization, all of that is going to reveal that deep work and help us move into our purpose.
Okay, I'm going to get two more questions into you, quick as they can be. The first question is, what does it mean to show up in love?
What does it mean to show up in love? To show up in your humanity and your vulnerability without judgment, to take ownership of the complexities of life, the messiness that this life is, to be so compassionate to your inner inner journey that you can't help but to stand in awe in the presence of someone else's without trying to fix it or change it or think it should be anything other than what it is. To love yourself and the fragility of the human experience so that we can love all as one, as interdependent and connected.
Beautiful. And my final question to you is, you say that there is only one true revolution and it begins within. So what can you leave our listeners with, knowing more about finding their inner revolution?
The evolution, I don't know if you can see my shirt, it says the revolution.
Right, I do. I love it. I want one.
I'll get you one. The evolution is the revolution. It's the work we do on ourselves. If we change ourselves, we will change this planet. It's like I said earlier, the systems are made up of people. Change the people, we change the system. But it requires a deep peeling back the layers of our shadow self to expose the light. And the work requires us to go inward. We're not here to seek, because that would suggest that what we're looking for is somehow out there. We're here to awaken to who we truly are, which is love. And when I awaken to the love in myself, I will see it in you. And there can't be poverty when there's love. There can't be racial terrorism. There can't be homophobia. There can't be any of the ways that divide us. It cannot exist if we all remember who we are and who we are to each other. Liberation and peace are inevitable, but it requires personal action. No longer can we point that finger out and tell everyone else what they have to do to change. The revolution is that we've got to dig in and change the disconnect in here. Then everything else will fall into place.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, Sean, for being my guest and for loving as big as you do, because we know you love big. Okay, so thank you. I loved having you here today. It went by far too quickly. So do yourself a favor, friends, and get Revolution of the Soul. You will absolutely love, love, love this journey that Sean takes you on. So until we meet again, from my heart to yours, stay safe, stay present, and stay kind.